You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corpinac.hu/en.
Welcome to MCC Podcast. My name is Peter Heltai and I will be the host of this episode. And in the coming 30 minutes or so, I will be speaking with Julius Krein, political writer, editor, and founder of the journal American Affairs, which defines itself as a hyper-partisan quarterly on public policy and political thought. Julius has become famous for being an active Trump supporter during the 2016 campaign. As a young intellectual, he believed that an unusual Republican candidate will be able to reshape American politics for the better. Only 10 months later, he published a disappointed article on the New York Times, basically claiming that due to the incoherent policies and communication of the president, the once favored campaign promises won't be fulfilled. After 3 years, I asked him if his opinion has changed since then. We also discussed American gerontocracy, which currently, according to Krein, is its zenith in the United States political and economic life, and why populist successes always come hand in hand with technocracy. Lastly, we touched upon the Biden administration's plans and how those might affect Central Europe and the EU in general. My first question would be about your opinion on the Trump administration, because you were in 2016 a Trump supporter yourself. And however, in an op-ed for the New York Times, only more or less 10 months after the elections, you wrote about why it was a mistake and why you sorely regretted your voting for Trump. And I'm sure that 1,000 people have asked you about why you wrote and what you wrote. But what really interests me, given that 3 years have passed after this article, is that have you regretted your article even a little bit? Could the policies and results of the Trump administration change your mind even a little?
Well, I mean, you have to remember that I don't write the headlines, on op-eds like that. The editors do, and that one was a particularly mawkish headline, which I think, really missed kind of the larger point. My argument there was, to me, the personal who wins, who loses elections is actually not that important in the grand scheme of things. It's the underlying policies and economic structures and other incentives that have a larger impact on policy, I think. So what I said in that article is, I think, Trump, the first few months of the Trump administration showed that he was far more interested in kind of stoking public controversies rather than seriously advancing the key agenda items from his 2016 campaign. And obviously, I just wrote a big article for the American Conservative and another group called American Compass. That's about 3,000 words in which I go through the kind of Trump policy legacy in general. And I think there were, some good things and some bad things. But on the whole, the problem is that Trump never was really able to advance or execute or implement or bring in people who could do any such thing to a coherent, cohesive policy vision that was in line with the 2016 campaign. He ended up sort of blowing in the wind on policy and often being misled by the Republican establishment and others, and sort of compensating for that with a lot of tweeting and a lot of, controversial rhetoric, which doesn't actually accomplish much. So in a nutshell, that's my view of the Trump administration. And I think one way or another, getting too wrapped up in the personalities of it or the individual candidates and campaigns is a mistake and leads to misunderstandings of how American politics actually works.
You wrote in 2017 you didn't give up yet on his national trade, healthcare, or foreign policy plans, for instance. So could they fulfill particularly these promises? Because these issues have been obviously strong pillars of the recent campaign as well.
Well, I mean, you have to say that the Trump administration did make significant progress on the trade front. culminating in the phase one China deal. So, you certainly have to give him credit for that. On the other hand, the administration actually cut a lot of programs that were, designed to promote American manufacturing and reshoring, and didn't really pursue that much at all, at least not really systematically or coherently. So the record on reshoring is mixed at best. It's the same with pretty much every other Trump area. If you want to take healthcare, on the one hand, the early attempt to repeal Obamacare, led by Paul Ryan and the congressional Republicans, totally moronic, total failure, totally unpopular. But if you look at later, actually just recently, the Trump administration finalized a rule, and this is getting very technical and opaque, and I'm sorry, but the Trump administration did finalize a sort of bureaucratic rule that tied the price that American Medicare pays for prescription drugs to the negotiated prices of other developed foreign countries, which is something that has been popular for a long time and people have tried to do for a long time, Democrat and Republican, and it took the Trump administration to actually get it done. So in pretty much all these policy areas, you find, you can find things on the positive side and on the negative side. The problem consistently for Trump is that it never added up into a coherent agenda. I would say, though, on foreign policy, he was probably the most consistent, and at least with respect to trying to end U.S. involvement in these long-running, endless wars like Afghanistan and so on. Though others would be more critical of him, perhaps for maybe accelerating tensions with Iran. I'm not an expert on that. I don't want to get into that. But pretty much throughout the Trump administration, you find a lot of cross-cutting ideological tendencies. So with most administrations, you have, they win some battles, they lose some, but they're always kind of trying to go in one direction. With Trump, you have wins and losses, but also an administration that's really trying to go in multiple directions at once. And I think that's what makes this administration so unique and in many ways very frustrating.
And what do you think where does this difference lie in foreign policy or in his foreign policy plans or results? He chose the right people, or what do you think? Why could he be so coherent or more coherent than, in your opinion, in any other fields?
In part, perhaps because the president has just a lot more direct control over foreign policy than he does over a lot of other policy areas. And in part, perhaps because a lot of these, big questions like withdrawal from Afghanistan, they've been around for a while. And they're not conceptually, at least in big picture, they're not that difficult to grasp. And they don't require a lot of command of details and minutia that Trump himself is perhaps not the best at. The other side to that, though, is there have been a lot of media reports of the military basically just disobeying or not executing, or basically finding ways to slow roll a lot of the administration's commands, to avoid withdrawals from places like Syria and stuff like that. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but I think this administration, more than many others, has had a much harder time executing on various things for all the reasons I mentioned previously.
And in your view, why did he lose the elections? I know it's a very general question, but
I think certainly the COVID-19 issue had a lot to do with it. And basically the disruption that caused to the economy, as well as, the administration basically having to take responsibility for some of the failures that occurred. I think in cases he was unfairly blamed for a lot of issues, but it doesn't matter when you're the president. As Truman said, the buck stops here. That's how it goes. The other part I would say is that, in many cases he failed to execute on his 2016 agenda. And like I said, he didn't actually do a whole lot on the issue of reshoring. He didn't do a whole lot on the issue on sort of labor issues. improving, outcomes for kind of lower quartile earners, working class people. There, in many cases, his policy wasn't actually there. And I think if you look, places like Michigan and Wisconsin that he won last time around, by narrow margins, the departure from those more interesting 2016 themes, I think very well could have cost him with some of those sort of union swing voters in those states where Biden seems to have taken them back. So I think, a combination of COVID plus failure to execute or insufficiently move along the goals of the 2016 campaign is what really cost him. He was much more of a conventional Bush-era Republican in 2020, and as we've seen, that just doesn't work. The Republican Party has lost 7 of 8 presidential popular votes now since 1988. That agenda just doesn't work.
In spite of all the criticism he has received, such a candidate, or at least in my opinion, as far as I see, hardly will appear among the Republicans in the near future. I don't know if you agree with that, but wasn't it also at the same time a big chance for the American right to somehow renew itself, at least, using Trump's image to redraw some fossilized party routines and strategies, using his extreme communication and all this figure somehow maybe provided, an opportunity for the Republicans to restart, to bring up new ideas, new faces, new strategies.
Absolutely. It was an opportunity. And while the party and Trump himself didn't make as much progress on that opportunity as I would have liked, I don't think it's over yet. This story will go on. In many cases, these debates have been kind of pushed under the rug by Trump's victory. Will probably become more intense now as, we begin looking to 2024 and the next elections. But there's no question that his ability to really win and dominate the Republican primaries, despite running, everyone thought that a Republican basically has to run on the Reagan agenda, 1980, and that's it. It's the Reagan 3-legged stool, and it's just a question of, the best way to manipulate that, but there's no real ideological question over what the core commitments of the party are. Trump, by crushing his rivals in the 2016 Republican primary, basically proved what a lot of people were suspecting, but no one was to attempt that, that agenda is passé and people want a new one, something that actually addresses the real problems of, the present and not the Reagan era. And that lesson is not forgotten. And there will be candidates who, I would say are probably more serious than Trump on policy questions and know a little bit more about how politics works and maybe can be more competent in addressing these issues. But there will be these issues at least. The question is, how much do they replicate the Trump 2016 campaign? I don't know. But it won't die. And, we'll see exactly where it goes. The big question is the Republican donor base doesn't want to move beyond, 1980. They want to stay there. But there are a number of Republican politicians and, thinkers and writers who are very much ready to move on. And that momentum is already there. And I don't think it's going away. Whether it wins the debate or not, I don't know. But there will definitely be debates on this question for the next several years.
Yes, and although Trump was something new, he's an old man. I mean, he's 74 years of age, and I just want to quote here your piece that you wrote on gerontocratic tendencies in America and in the United States, and how other generations dominate public offices and the academic life. At the same time, you're talking about the country's leadership apart from political debates, but still from reading this article from Budapest or from Central Europe or from Europe in general, it was a bit unusual to me reading your thoughts, considering the fact that for instance in Central European politics we have almost got used to this sort of default position that if a conservative or a right-wing agenda gains decisive popularity or simply wins in an election, for instance, is the fault of the pensioners or the uneducated people of the villages or both. I could mention the media echoes of the latest Hungarian or Polish elections, or take Brexit. So has the time, do you think, arrived in America when other people or other generations or a political or academic elite, which consists of the other generations, don't or can't guarantee the revival of conservative values in society?
I mean, what I would say is that the generational divides in American politics and American culture are actually probably greater in many respects than merely partisan divides. So, the difference between Joe Biden, for example, and younger Democrats is probably greater than that between younger Democrats and younger Republicans in some ways. Mm-hmm. And I think in both parties you have now Trump is somewhat of and actually Bernie Sanders has this too, where he's an old man but representing kind of a younger, something popular among the young. Trump, of course, is personally, advanced in age, but he probably does, more than any other candidate in 2016, at least, represented kind of the newer direction of younger people on the right in America. But there are, I think going forward, you see it's actually the younger Republican politicians, whether it's someone like a Josh Hawley, senator, or even people like Rubio, Tom Cotton. It's people on the younger side who are more in tune with where younger people in the Republican Party are going, and probably fair to say the same on the left. But there's no question that the new agenda, however one wants to define it, that Trump sort of ushered in 2016, every Republican, or at least far more Republican staffers, thinkers, voters, whomever, you get under the age of 50 even, and they're much more interested in these questions that Trump was talking about and going in a new direction than if you talk to people over 70 or whatever. So a lot of the realignment on both right and left will be, I think, generational. And if the baby boomer generation ever lets go of power, which they don't seem to be doing anytime soon, but if they do, I think you'll get a lot of change in both parties.
So do you think that probably the next candidate of the Republicans will be a younger one?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, a lot of people hope that among the Democratic Party this year, but as you saw, we got Joe Biden. So I wouldn't say there's any guarantee, but as time goes on, the odds of younger people rising up do improve, I think.
I've listened to your recent talk in the Realignment podcast as well, and you speak about the connection between and the symbiosis between populists and technocrats, and more precisely, to put it maybe, that the success of populists or populist politicians lie more in their serious policy results rather than their strong rhetorics. Did I sum it up right?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate summary. And the other thing
that's a very interesting thought. So maybe if you can tell a little bit more about it, how do you see it, or how can it affect the future of politics, especially in the West?
Yeah, well, I mean, I took it from, if you just look at the Trump administration, what I think the good things they accomplished were the populist things that were consistent with the 2016 campaign. Those almost all came through the technocratic parts of government, executive agencies, executive orders, often the very opaque administrative apparatus, like the Medicare drug prescription thing I was talking about earlier. If you look at what Congress did, it was the same establishment Republican agenda, or nothing at all. And, I would say that actually at this point, the more mass media you get, at least in America, the more expensive it is to do that. And therefore, the more difficult it is to get anything through that really challenges the status quo or goes in a new direction. and therefore populist policy simply has a better chance within the technocratic apparatus of government. And I think the Trump administration sort of demonstrates that. And I would also say that I'm not an expert on Hungary or Europe or anything like that, but I think what we've seen there is unlike the conventional American conservative view of the goal of conservatives is getting rid of the state, getting rid of dismantling the administrative state is their slogan. Reducing the government's ability to do anything. What you actually do is you build up a strong state that can prosecute conservative goals and actually advance the positions, populist positions, nationalist positions, whatever you want to call them. It's not only necessary but desirable, and a failure to do that leads to a failure to really get anything done. So a lot of this article is actually really just responding to a kind of ingrained American tendency going back, to Reagan and probably a lot longer than that, which is that the American right stands for getting rid of government. I think that's been a huge mistake over the last 5, 6, 7 decades. And it's one that needs to be reversed. And I think there's a lot of empirical evidence really that argues for moving on from that.
You mentioned that you are not an expert on European politics, which I respect, but I would like to pose you a question on this as well, because especially from a Hungarian perspective, well, the Biden administration doesn't seem to be like the beginning of a beautiful friendship, to say the least. So just to ask from this perspective, do you think that Trump's approach to Central Europe or to Europe or leaders like the Polish government or Orban was also inconsistent in this sense? On the other hand, what do you think? What can Europe or Central Europe in particular await from a future Biden administration?
Well, I think, to start with the first question, I mean, rhetorically, certainly the Trump administration was very favorable to Central and Eastern Europe. I don't think you can really fault them for anything there, as far as I know. I would say, however, that on the sort of deeper structural questions around how Europe and the EU is governed, around the euro currency, yet they were pretty ineffective and probably strengthened the hand of Germany and Western Europe, the major Western European countries, or at least really didn't do much in sort of shifting the perceptions within Europe or even within American politics, which is evidenced by the fact that Biden is going to come in. And as you mentioned, I mean, he's already been very vocal in criticizing countries like Hungary and Poland. So, the fundamental structural change, Trump really didn't do much on that. And by maybe, raising the issue, it may come back to haunt a lot of the sort of goals he rhetorically tried to advance. But we'll see. I mean, the best case probably for Hungary, Poland, others in the Biden administration is just not to make news at all. And they frankly have a lot more important things to deal with and bigger battles to fight. So I don't know how much political capital they'll really want to waste on dealing with Hungary and Poland. But certainly they're rhetorically and to all outward appearances not very friendly to those countries. I think an interesting question vis-a-vis Europe, and one which I think countries that would like to exert some sway on the U.S. should pursue, would be issues around the big American tech companies. Because obviously there's a lot of debates and battles going on here in America domestically over those. And there's a lot of interesting questions happening in Europe regarding the taxation of those companies, around censorship, around privacy, all sorts of things. So I would say, in addition to the various military cooperation and alliances that Biden, on the one hand, is going to, try to at least rhetorically defend or improve. The other big question that European countries can try to really become players and significant factors in U.S. politics politics would be around controlling the big tech companies.
Yes, it's probably true. And just to close a very interesting conversation, I would like to ask about your personal project, the American Affairs Journal. I read that some of its, I don't know, critics or supporters, but said once that it's a journal that understands Trump more than he understands himself. So now that the political landscape is changing in the US, or at least the government, what's going to be the journal's mission during the soon official Biden administration? How do you see the future of American affairs?
Yeah, again, I mean, if Americans love to think that whomever they vote for is the most important thing in the world. It's a very self-flattering notion. But we never, our view of politics was never about any one person winning or losing office. And we certainly, people have said that about us, but we never viewed our project as, dependent on the Trump campaign or really having anything to do with it. We would have loved if, they were interested in our ideas and wanted to work with us to do them, but of course they didn't. So, to me, the same issues that gave rise to Trump are still mostly there. They haven't really been addressed that much at all. And actually a lot of the intellectual momentum is really going our way. And we're having a much, we're in a much better position on a lot of these issues than we were 4 years ago when we started the journal. And the biggest evidence of that really is that, part of the Joe Biden campaign was a, quote, made in America agenda about bringing back manufacturing and stuff like that. Were they sincere about that? I don't know. We'll have to see. But the point is that these ideas have reached a lot broader relevance than they had before. And if anything, there's a lot more people from all over the political map in Congress, perhaps, in the Biden administration, among the up-and-coming Republican candidates and others who are more interested in these questions than ever, as well as, I think a reorientation of some of the intellectual discourse. So I actually, am probably, we're entering the Biden administration in a much stronger position than where we started, and a lot more people are paying attention to our issues. So I think that's a good thing, and we'll see where it goes.
Julius Krein, thank you very much for being here with us at MCC Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.